Now, I want to turn to Republican Senator Marco of Florida, a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Greg. Good morning.
How did we get here? Do you agree with some of your colleagues who say it's the weakness of President Obama and the United States right now that has emboldened President Putin of Russia?
Well, I think our policy towards Russia under this administration deserves a heavy amount of criticism. I usually shy away from that in moments of crisis when it's important for the nation to speak with one voice, and I'm encouraged by much of what I've heard Secretary Kerry just say a moment ago, although there are things I'd like to see us do in addition to the steps he's outlined. But I do think, in hindsight, as we look forward to our future relationship with Russia, it's important to learn from the errors of the last few years where I think we have not accurately, through this administration, assessed clearly what it is Russia's goals are under Vladimir Putin. They're not interested in building an international norm that nations conduct themselves under, like what Secretary Kerry was just describing a moment ago. They're interested in reconstituting Russian power and Russian prestige, often at the expense of U.S. national interests.
But what do you do about that? Because that was true under President Bush as well, who famously said that he thought he could trust Vladimir Putin only to find out that he couldn't, and then Putin invaded separatist region of Georgia, and the U.S. really didn't do much about it. Isn't the same predicament here, which is you may know what Putin wants to do, but what are you prepared to do in terms of the use of American power to stop it?
Well, first of all, I think, like as I said, I think previous administrations deserve criticism as well with regards to clearly viewing what Vladimir Putin's goals are here. I think moving forward, if you look at, for example, Secretary Kerry a moment ago mentioned success with the START treaty, yet we know that the Russians have basically violated every major treaty they've ever entered into. We see how they've basically lied. I mean, let's call it what it is. They are lying, and they are. This government is a government of liars, the Russian government. And you see what's happening now in Crimea. I mean, they're claiming they're not there. You've got these individuals showing up in unmarked uniforms, wearing masks, but clearly they're Russian troops. Refuse to acknowledge it. So you're dealing with a government that lies as a matter of course, and it's very difficult to enter an understanding with them on anything when they are willing to lie and cover things up in this way.
You're saying, as you did in a piece that you wrote for Politico about how to confront Russia, that we got to use blunt talk. So I ask you for some blunt talk. Is Russia an enemy of the United States now?
I think they're increasingly behaving like an enemy of international peace and international norms. If you look after the end of World War II and certainly through the Cold War era, the spread of democracy and freedom and established norms for nations to interact with one another so that we would never have another world war. Russia doesn't, under this president, Putin, does not seem interested in any of that. So they are an enemy of that, and they are certainly, as it regards to that, an enemy of the United States, and with regards to those things I've just outlined. And if you look at the positions they've taken on issue after issue, Russia has been an obstacle to U.S. national interests.
Is it a concern of yours that 10 days ago the president said we're watching and we want to make sure that nobody crosses the line or there'll be consequences? Last Sunday at this table, Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, said it'd be a grave mistake for Russia to invade the Crimea. On Friday, the president says there'll be a cost to intervention. What does it say to you that Vladimir Putin has ignored the United States for 10 days?
Well, part of it is he's made a cost-benefit analysis. He has weighed the costs of doing what he's done, and he has viewed the benefits of it. And clearly he has concluded that the benefits far outweigh the costs. We need to endeavor to change that calculus. And I think Secretary Kerry outlined accurately enough that one of our goals here needs to be to isolate Russia, to exact an extraordinary price to pay on the international front for them, for their ambitions, ultimately for individuals in that government and for their economy. The other part of this that's not receiving enough attention is the U.S. must convene our allies, both in Europe and through NATO, to strengthen the interim government in Kiev, to allow them to transition to a more stable government, be able to hold their elections. That's critical too, because I think the next phase in this, perhaps you're seeing the outlines of it already, are Russians trying to undermine the government in Kiev.
Do you think there's a military option here for the United States or for NATO? In other words, do you advocate now going beyond what you just heard from Secretary Kerry, which was economic isolation, perhaps expelling Russia from the G8, particular sanctions to key Russian officials and the like?
Well, I think if you're asking me whether the U.S. should be taking military strikes against Russian troops in Ukraine or in Crimea, I would argue to you that I don't think anyone is advocating for that. I am saying, however, that our NATO alliance needs to be reinvigorated. It is an important alliance. If you look at countries that neighbor Ukraine now, for example, Poland and others who are part of that alliance, I think we need to be providing them assurances of the importance of this alliance, including perhaps revisiting, or in fact, I think we should revisit the missile defense shield that we talked about so often. Beyond that, I would say that as part of strengthening and stabilizing the government in Kiev now so that they can transition to stability down the road as well, I think part of that should be strengthening their defense capabilities, because I think this threat is a long-term one that they're facing.
You've also been focused on foreign policy challenges in our hemisphere in Venezuela as there are protests there against the Maduro government and a crackdown against protesters in the streets. What would you like to see this administration do?
Well, two things. First, I think we need to clearly pronounce ourselves as more than just concerned about what's happening in Venezuela. We need to say very clearly the United States and its people and its government are firmly on the side of the ambitions and the desires, the rightful desires of the people in the street, the students and the young people protesting against these violations. Beyond that, I would like to see specific U.S. sanctions against individuals in the Maduro government that are systematically participating in the violation of human rights and anti-democratic actions. I think those two steps would go a long way in that regard.
I want to ask you a couple of questions about politics. Home. One has to do with the big controversy out of Arizona, a bill that was vetoed by the governor, and the general concern that some conservatives in the party have that as gay rights advance specifically, that sometimes religious freedom in this country is being trampled on. Is this a key issue for Republicans, you think, in this election year?
Well, here's what the key issue is. On the one hand, I think Americans, myself included, the vast majority of conservatives as well, are against discrimination. The notion that someone, because they are gay, would be denied service at a restaurant or so forth is something not Americans don't support, conservatives don't support. The other side of the equation is, imagine now if you are a Southern Baptist or a Catholic or evangelical photographer who does not believe, because of your faith, in gay marriage. And because of that, you don't want to provide photographic services for a gay marriage. Should you be sanctioned by the state for refusing to do so? I think that's what they endeavored to deal with in Arizona. I don't know never read the law. As I said, we've been pretty busy this week on a number of fronts. The governor maybe felt that law extended beyond that, but that is also a legitimate concern, and it's one we're going to have to balance here as this issue continues to unfold across the states here in America.
But you don't think this was an open and shut case? This was tough for you? You think the law had some merit without saying that you support it?
Well, I don't believe that gay Americans should be denied services at a restaurant or hotel or anything of that nature. I also don't believe, however, that a caterer or a photographer should be punished by the state for refusing to provide services for a gay wedding because of their religious held beliefs. So we've got to figure out a way to protect that as well.
I know you and others who are often talked about as presidential candidates in 2016 are trying to deal with the business at hand. Nevertheless, there's a lot of speculation about your standing. And I want to read Chris Liz in the Washington Post, who recently wrote this. No matter what Rubio does now to placate conservatives, his opponents in 2016 will make sure to remind those same voters of his involvement in legislation that provided a path to citizenship for undocumented workers. That may be, well be a terrific resume point in a general election where Republicans badly need to court Hispanics. It's not likely to be popular at all among many conservatives in places like Iowa and South Carolina, two states that cast some of the earliest votes for president in 2016. Are you damaged goods among conservatives because of your support for that immigration bill?
I don't know. I never made that political calculus. I certainly knew going into immigration reform that it's not exactly the kind of issue you take on with regards to becoming politically popular among some segments. But I would say the concerns that conservatives have about immigration reform are legitimate ones. And what I endeavored to do is to try to find a solution to a real problem the country is confronting. And I understand it's a difficult one. I knew that going in. I'll continue to do what's right for the country, what I believe to be right on issue after issue. And where that leads me politically, that's what elections are for and campaigns are for. But I'm not going to let future political considerations stop me from doing what I believe is right for the country or doing my job during my time in the Senate.
Are you undeterred at this point? Will you pursue the presidency in 2016?
Well, I haven't made that decision and certainly didn't come on here this morning to make that announcement, but I will say that that's something I'll consider later in this year, early next year. As you know, in 2016, my term in the Senate expires, so I'll have a decision to make either way. I certainly think our country's at an important crossroads on the international front and also on a domestic front, and I'll have to think about whether from that role in the presidency I would be able to influence that in a more positive way.
Senator Rubio, a lot going on here internationally and in our politics. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Appreciate it.
Thank you.